My mom announced my engagement at the Rotary lunch. I wasn't dating anyone. If you grew up in a small town, you know how fast a microphone turns into fate. In 90 seconds of cheerful housekeeping, she plugged the pancake breakfast, thanked sponsors, and gift-wrapped my future. The room nodded, clapped, moved on. A mother like mine believed stability came from narrative control. A daughter like me learned that quiet compliance kept the gravy boat from shaking. I lived in Maple Glen, Ohio, and worked as a planning analyst, grants, zoning maps, downtown revitalization. People think it's benches, it's trust. In places like ours, the archetype that wins is the arranger, the person who assigns roles before anyone auditions. She saw an unmarried daughter as an open loop, and open loops made donors nervous. The town preferred closed stories. Evan Keller was the name she attached to me like a label maker. His family owned Keller Hardware and chaired the Merchants Association. We'd spoken twice about a facade grant and sync permits for the market. He was decent, polite, and absolutely not my boyfriend. But in her calculus, 2 committee meetings plus proximity to a sponsorship check equaled destiny. Announce something publicly, and it becomes true enough to work with. The stakes weren't just personal. I was shepherding a $400,000 streetscape grant, and Keller Hardware was an in-kind partner on materials. If I looked entwined with Evan, I looked compromised. The archetype flips fast there. The helpful daughter becomes the insider, and the insider kills a grant. The room saw raffles and smiles. I saw emails, disclosures, and a rumor hardening into a memo on my desk. When lunch wrapped, I packed maps into my tote and breathed through the coffee steam. My phone buzzed. Congrats! From 3 merchants. Happy for you too. From a council member. Then a message from my boss. We should talk today. That made it real. The first thing I did was laugh out loud in the parking lot. A dry, awkward sound that didn't belong to humor. My boss, Dana, wasn't someone you could brush off with a shrug. She had the look of a woman who saw every hidden string in this town and pulled whichever one kept the lights on. If she wanted to talk today, it meant the rumor had already crossed from gossip to governance. I drove back to City Hall with my tote bag on the passenger seat, staring at the "Congrats" texts that kept stacking. Each one was another nail. People weren't asking if it was true. They were congratulating, confirming it in their own minds. And once that many minds aligned, it was harder to fight than if my mom had just told me outright in the kitchen. You might think, why not just correct them? But here's where archetypes matter. The denier always looks worse than the storyteller. Nobody likes the person who ruins a cheerful script. Dana didn't waste time. She closed the office door and held up her phone with a raised eyebrow. So you and Evan, anything I should know before the merchants' meeting? She said it flat, no judgment, but I could hear the undercurrent. Conflicts of interest, appearances, disclosure forms. She lived in the realm of perception, not just fact, and perception was already moving fast. I tried explaining. It's not true. My mom, she got carried away. It sounded weak, even to me. Dana tapped her pen against the desk and studied me like a chessboard. She wasn't accusing, but she was calculating risk. Then you need to get ahead of it, publicly. That word carried weight, publicly. Once you say something in the open, it changes what people believe more than any private denial ever could. Walking out of her office, I felt the shape of the trap. If I denied too sharply, I looked defensive. If I played along, I tied myself to Evan and jeopardized the grant. The archetypal daughter was being squeezed between the good citizen and the suspect insider. Neither role fit, but silence wouldn't save me. By the end of the day, the Chamber of Commerce had tagged me and Evan in a Facebook post about Maple Glen's favorite new couple. And that's when I realized my mom's announcement wasn't just awkward, it was turning into a political problem. That Facebook post spread faster than any zoning update I'd ever worked on. By the time I got home, it had 40 comments and a string of heart emojis. People tagged each other, half joking about wedding venues, caterers, and whether Evan and I would get the big Victorian house on Sycamore. It was small-town theater, but theater with teeth. Once a narrative took root, it didn't matter if it was planted on rocky ground. My phone buzzed again, this time with Evan's name. We'd never texted before. His message was short. I think we need to talk. That line could have meant 10 things, but I knew it wasn't friendly banter. I called him, and he picked up right away. His voice was steady, but I could tell he was careful. "Look, I don't know what your mom was trying to do, but my phone hasn't stopped either." Customers congratulating me, my uncle calling from Dayton. This complicates things. The archetype had shifted for him too. A hardware store owner isn't just a merchant. In a place like ours, he was the town provider, and providers are supposed to project stability, trust, legacy. Being suddenly linked to me gave him credibility in some eyes, but it also tied him to City Hall decisions. We both had reputations that depended on neutrality, and now neutrality was slipping away. I told him the truth. I hadn't known, hadn't agreed, hadn't even spoken to my mom since she said it. He let out a slow breath, then said, "We can't just ignore it. People already believe it. The longer we wait, the worse it looks." He wasn't wrong. That night, lying on my couch with my laptop, I scrolled through the comments until I couldn't anymore. I thought about archetypes again, the way towns like ours crown characters. My mom had cast me as the settled daughter, the one who'd finally arrived. Evan was drafted as the dependable suitor. And the audience? They were already invested. The next morning, I knew I'd have to meet Evan face to face. Not to plan a denial, not to make a scene, but to figure out whether we'd fight the story or use it. Evan suggested we meet at the diner on Main Street. Neutral ground, crowded enough to look casual, but not so loud that people couldn't eavesdrop. That was the irony, choosing a place where everyone could see us, so it would look normal. I sat in a red vinyl booth, watching the door, thinking about how appearances worked like currency in Maple Glen. He walked in wearing his work jacket with the Keller Hardware logo stitched on the chest. Practical, unpolished, but somehow it played into his role as the town's provider. When he slid into the booth, he didn't waste time. "We need alignment. If you say one thing and I say another, this whole town will twist it into whatever suits them." His tone wasn't angry. It was businesslike. He understood the stakes as much as I did. I laid it out. "My boss is worried about the grant. If people think we're actually engaged, it looks like I steered money your way. Even if I didn't, perception is enough to sink it." Evan leaned back, arms crossed, thinking. He wasn't oblivious. He knew how the optics worked, but he also knew the value of goodwill. "From my side," he said, "this is boosting business. Folks come in, ask about the big news, and end up buying a new set of drill bits. I can't say it's hurting me." That's when I felt the squeeze. The archetype of the pragmatist had entered the stage. He wasn't fighting the rumor. He was weighing its benefits. And it wasn't malicious. He was simply doing what any small-town business owner would do, turning attention into sales. Meanwhile, I was boxed in as the ethical professional, the one expected to keep clean lines between personal and public. Over coffee, we agreed on one thing. We wouldn't fuel the story. No public denials yet, no confirmations either. Just a holding pattern while we figured out the least damaging way out. It was the safest compromise, but compromises rarely hold in towns where speculation is sport. As we stood up to leave, the waitress smirked and said, "On the house, for the happy couple." She winked, sliding the bill back into her apron. I glanced at Evan. He smiled politely, but I could see the calculation behind his eyes. This wasn't going away on its own. By the end of that week, I realized silence was a kind of fertilizer. The less I said, the more the rumor grew. At a zoning workshop, one of the council members asked if I'd be changing my last name on the paperwork. At the grocery store, an older woman clasped my hand and whispered, "Your mom must be over the moon." These weren't questions. They were confirmations disguised as pleasantries. I kept reminding myself how archetypes operated here. Once a character was established, people looked for proof to reinforce it. If they saw me with Evan at the diner, that was Exhibit A. If they heard my mom glowing at the Rotary, that was Exhibit B. Each fragment stacked until the myth became sturdier than reality. And the problem wasn't just personal embarrassment, it was structural. The grant depended on credibility. If the Department of Development smelled even a hint of favoritism, $400,000 would vanish into another county. My mom, of course, doubled down. At Sunday dinner, she beamed across the table and asked Evan, who she'd, casually, invited to pass the potatoes. He went along politely, but his presence turned the meal into a stage. My cousins teased, My uncle offered to lend his backyard for the rehearsal dinner, and I sat there biting back the urge to flip the table. My mom believed she was casting me into the archetype of the chosen daughter, the one who carried forward the family's respectability. In her mind, she was helping. Driving home that night, I thought about how much easier it would be to let the story play out, to smile and nod until the town lost interest. But I knew better. In places like Maple Glen, stories never dissolved, they calcified. And the longer I played along, the more impossible it would be to disentangle fact from fiction. That Monday, Dana called me into her office again. She didn't look angry, just pragmatic. "If this doesn't get clarified, we'll have to assign the grant oversight to someone else." She meant it kindly, as a precaution, but it landed like a threat. Losing the project wasn't just losing work. It was losing the professional identity I'd been building for years. That's when I understood. The real choice wasn't between denying or confirming. It was between keeping my career intact or letting my mom's narrative swallow me whole. I didn't sleep much that night. My apartment felt too quiet, and my phone buzzed every couple of hours with another tag, another well-meaning message. I stared at the ceiling and kept running through the roles I was being forced into. Good daughter, happy fiancé, compromised professional. None of them felt like me, but the town had already decided I was playing them. By Tuesday morning, I had a plan, though it wasn't polished. I asked Evan to meet me again, this time at his store before opening hours. He led me through aisles of paint cans and toolboxes, the smell of sawdust clinging to the air. It struck me how rooted he looked here, surrounded by things built to last. I laid out the situation bluntly. "If I don't clear this up, I'll be taken off the grant. That's years of work gone. I need you to back me up when I tell people it isn't true." Evan studied me, leaning against a counter. He wasn't dismissive, but he was slower to agree than I hoped. "I get it," he said finally. "But from where I stand, this rumor's been good for business. People see me as more settled, more dependable. That matters in a family-owned shop." His words weren't cruel, they were practical. That's when I saw the archetype divide again. For him, this was opportunity. For me, it was liability. I pressed him. "If you don't deny it with me, you're confirming it by default." That landed. He rubbed the back of his neck and nodded. "All right, we'll straighten it out. But it's going to upset people. They like their stories neat." That last line stuck with me. He was right. People preferred narratives where every piece fit. The archetype of the settled couple was easy for Maple Glen to cheer for. Two recognizable names, both tied to the community, fitting neatly into the town's idea of continuity. Undoing it meant disappointing more than just my mom. It meant disappointing the whole town. When I left the hardware store, I felt the weight of what was coming. This wasn't just going to be a correction, it was going to be a rupture. And in small towns, ruptures always left cracks that never fully sealed. We decided the easiest path was to make a joint statement at the merchants' meeting. It was neutral ground, full of people who already had skin in the game. If we could shut the rumor down there, it might trickle out more effectively than a Facebook post. At least, that was the theory. That afternoon, I drafted a few sentences. Clear, professional, almost sterile. "Evan and I respect each other, but there is no engagement. Any confusion has been unintentional, and we appreciate the support of the community." No fluff, no wiggle room. When I showed it to him, he smirked. "You really think people will swallow that? Half the town's already planning the wedding playlist." He wasn't being unkind. He was being realistic. In archetypal terms, he knew the audience doesn't want an anticlimax. Walking into the meeting hall the next evening, I felt the air shift before we said anything. People turned their heads, whispers buzzing. The two of us arriving together only fed the illusion. The merchant president clapped Evan on the shoulder, winked at me, and said, "Let's save you to a table." No script we read was going to erase that energy. When it was our turn to speak, Evan stood beside me, arms crossed but relaxed. I read the statement, word for word, keeping my voice steady. There was a polite murmur of acknowledgement, a few chuckles, even some clapping. But then someone called out, Sure, see you at the wedding." The room erupted in laughter. Not mean, just entertained. And in that moment, I understood something sharp. Denial doesn't work when the audience prefers the story. Afterward, a council member pulled me aside. "That was the right thing to do," she said quietly. "But you know how people are. It'll take time. Her words carried a mix of sympathy and warning. The archetype had been announced, cemented, and publicly fed. Undoing it wasn't going to be a single act. It was going to be a campaign. As Evan and I walked out together, the absurdity of it all hung between us. He finally broke the silence. You realize, the more we try to kill this, the more alive it looks? He wasn't wrong, and I had no idea what to try next. The next morning, Dana called me into her office again. She had the kind of tired patience that comes from years of watching Maple Glen cycle through dramas like Weather Fronts. You did the right thing last night, she said, but perception lingers. The grant committee is already asking questions. That was the line I dreaded. The money wasn't gone yet, but it was wobbling. I tried explaining how we'd made the statement, how we'd been clear. Dana nodded, but her eyes told me clarity wasn't the issue. In small towns, she said, facts aren't the currency. Believability is. And right now, people believe the version with the cake and rings. It was hard to argue. Even as she spoke, my phone buzzed with a text from my cousin. Love the denial strategy. Classic. Followed by a string of laughing emojis. At lunch, I ran into Evan outside the courthouse. He looked almost amused, carrying a box of paint samples. So, he said, we told the truth, and now they think we're staging some elaborate cover-up. I didn't realize we were this interesting. I wanted to be annoyed, but he wasn't wrong. Archetypes don't dissolve when contradicted. They just absorb the contradiction and grow stronger. Now we weren't only the happy couple. We were the mysterious couple, hiding something. That evening, my mom dropped by unannounced, casserole dish in hand. She acted innocent, but I could see the glint in her eye. Honey, I heard about your little statement. People are just teasing. Don't take it so seriously. To her, it was all harmless, a social game. But she wasn't the one whose professional credibility was slipping by the day. She didn't grasp that her announcement hadn't just rewritten my personal life. It had jeopardized the biggest project of my career. After she left, I sat on the couch and let the casserole cool untouched. The realization hit me hard. Correcting the story wasn't enough. I'd have to actively replace it with another narrative people liked better. Otherwise, they'd keep clinging to the engagement like it was their favorite local soap opera. And in Maple Glen, nobody changes the channel until something juicier comes along. I spent the next few days thinking less like a planner and more like a strategist. If Maple Glen demanded a story, I needed to supply one. Something credible, tidy, and less damaging than a fake engagement. People didn't cling to narratives because they were true. They clung to them because they were satisfying. My mistake had been trying to deny without offering an alternative. Evan, to his credit, agreed to meet again, this time at the park near the river walk. Kids played on the swings, joggers passed, and the two of us sat on a bench looking like any other pair in town. So what's the new plan? He asked, half curious, half resigned. I told him bluntly, we redirect. Instead of pretending nothing happened, we give them a different story to hold on to. He raised an eyebrow. Such as? I suggested the obvious. Frame it as a collaboration. Not personal, but civic. We were working closely together on the streetscape project, and my mom had gotten carried away connecting dots that weren't there. We'd turn the narrative toward professional partnership, not romance. It wouldn't erase the engagement rumor overnight, but it would give people a new archetype to latch onto. The builder duo instead of the happy couple. Evan listened, then nodded slowly. It might work. At least it puts us in control instead of letting your mom or the chamber write the script. That was the first time he sounded like an ally rather than an unwilling co-star. The next morning, we put it into action. A joint op-ed in the Maple Glen Gazette. A photo of us standing by the downtown plan map, smiling like colleagues. The headline read, Partnership for Progress. Keller Hardware and City Planning join forces. It was clean, official, and boring enough to seem credible. But as I folded the paper and set it on my desk, I knew the real test wasn't the article. It was whether the town preferred the new story or clung to the old one. No matter how neatly we packaged the truth, the Gazette piece did its job, at least on the surface. At the coffee shop, people brought up the article instead of the engagement. A few even praised us for thinking ahead about Maple Glen's future. It wasn't total silence on the wedding talk, but it was softer now, more of a joke than an assumption. That shift mattered. In small towns, jokes fade faster than truths. Dana called me into her office again a week later, this time with less tension in her shoulders. "Good move with the paper," she said. "The grant committee noticed. They'll keep you on the project as long as things stay clear." For the first time in weeks, I exhaled without my chest tightening. Professionally, I was safe, for now. Evan and I settled into an odd rhythm. We weren't friends, exactly, but we had a mutual respect born of crisis management. Sometimes he'd stop by City Hall with supply invoices, and we'd exchange a look that said, without words, "Still dealing with it." Over time, the engagement rumor didn't vanish. It just shrank into the background noise of Maple Glen, tucked between gossip about the high school coach and complaints about potholes. My mom never apologized, not directly. In her mind, she had only accelerated what made sense. But she did tone it down after seeing how far it nearly spun out. At one Sunday dinner, she set the rolls on the table and said nothing about me or Evan. That silence, for her, was as close to contrition as I'd ever get. Looking back, I realized I'd been shoved into roles I didn't choose, but I also learned how quickly you can flip a script if you supply the town with something else to chew on. In Maple Glen, stories weren't destroyed, they were replaced. And while the rumor never fully died, it stopped defining me. It was bittersweet. I kept my career intact, but I also learned that sometimes in small towns, control isn't about truth. It's about steering the narrative just enough to keep yourself from being swallowed whole.